With all the sputtering I've been doing, I put a Housley in my mouth. Heard about one preacher, he would always put a mint in his mouth and kind of timed it just right, because when the mint was done, it was time to quit preaching. But one Sunday, he just kept on, and he began to realize, surely something is wrong. And he just says, I guess I'll just quit. And he got to the back, and he spit it out, and it was a rock. But I promise you, I have a Halls. And I think I can preach probably better with a Halls in my mouth tonight than not having a Halls in my mouth. Turn over to Exodus chapter 13. Exodus 13. And I mentioned this morning Exodus 13 and 14, and usually trying to look at two chapters. We're just going to look at Exodus 13. This way we don't rush as much, and if anything, getting through quicker might be better as well. Exodus 13 has two or three very important things to learn. In our study, whether it was Exodus or any other of the passages we've looked at over the last few years, as it was Last to Leaders, Bible Bowl material, my goal is, yes, we look at things within the text to see what's happening there, but also then to see how can this be applied? You know, what can I learn from this that helps me know about me and God? And I know here we are in Exodus 13, and somebody might think, oh, look at that. That's a consecration of the firstborn, a feast of unleavened bread, pillars of cloud and fire. And they start reading it, and then they get through, and man, this is mostly about this feast and these rules. And I don't have to do these feasts, and these rules don't apply to me being under the old law. But I promise you, there's some good lessons to learn in Exodus 13. Start with verse 1. And the Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the firstborn to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and beast, is mine. Well, now in verse 3, he talks about this remembering and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and rules for that. We get down to verse 11, and 11 through 16 seems to kind of take up where verses 1 and 2 left off. And you get over to see verse 11. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. If you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your you shall redeem. In Numbers 18:16, you find the price of redemption, and it was 5 silver shekels. And it was to be done a month after that child was born. And so here you're seeing this redemption. And then you get to verse 13, middle part of it, verse 14. And when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? See, this was a reminder. The firstborn died in Egypt. Now every firstborn, there's that reminder. By the way, about this reminding business, yep, verse 3 and following, there's that Feast of Unleavened Bread. And he gives the instructions about it. Get down to verse 8. You shall tell your son on that day. Make sure your children know. And you don't quit doing it, and you do it so they'll ask you, why are we doing this, Daddy? Okay. We don't have this kind of redemption today of the firstborn. We don't have this feast of unleavened bread today. But I promise you this, the importance of your children learning God's will, no less important. And it's like, here, you got all this about Egypt and let my people go, the plagues. Then finally that last plague, and Pharaoh says, go. And they leave. Then you got this passing through the Red Sea, the wilderness wanderings. And he takes the time to say, you tell your children. You tell your children. And you do this so your children even ask you. Like I said, I think that's an important lesson to learn that has application to today. I just say this, don't take it for granted. I hope you have your children in Sunday school class. And we have good teachers. They can learn a lot there. I hope you have your children back on Wednesday nights and they know that's a priority. We're going to set aside everything else. We're going to be here Wednesday night. And once again, they've got good teachers and they learn. And I'd hope that any other VBS or any other activity, go have your children here. This does not take the place of what happens in the home. We need to be telling our children. Now go back and look at verse 3. Look at verse 3. Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. No unleavened bread shall be eaten. Day in the month of Abib you are going out, and when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this service in this month. And then he gives some specific instructions. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the seventh day there'll be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you, and no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory. You should tell your children on that day, it's because of what the Lord did for you that I came out of Egypt. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. And then in verse 10, you shall therefore keep this statute as it is appointed, time from year to year. Verse 7 has a remember. Verse 9 has a memorial. This idea of remembering is something I hope that you kind of key in on. After 9/11, 2001, and the disaster of that day, I know you remember hearing these words, never forget, never forget. I'm amazed sometimes, the small towns you can drive through, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and in the middle of that town there will be a monument and the names of soldiers. Usually it's World War I or World War II. Names on that monument of men in that county or that town that died in that war. When I was making trips to Ukraine, I didn't go to very many towns, but I tell you this, every town I went to, there was a World War II memorial. Because so many people there lost their lives during World War II, and it was their way of, let's remember, let's remember. And so it is, we need to be remembering. A lot of our study, it's not so much that we are always learning something new, but we're reminding ourselves of things sometimes we've already studied. Every Sunday, what is this bread? And what is this fruit of the vine? It's a memorial. By this we remember Jesus, His body and His blood. In 2 Peter chapter 1, it's a passage that it always has impressed me. It's verse 9 that I'm talking about. But it says, whoever lacks these qualities are the faith, virtue, knowledge, self-control, steadfastness, godliness, brotherly affection, love. These Christian graces that you read of from verses 5 through 7. And then in verse 8, if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 9. Whoever lacks these qualities is so nearsighted that he's blind. And look at these words. Having forgotten that he was cleansed from his former sins. He's saying, you don't put these things in your life. You get that point. You forget what Jesus did for you. Having forgotten that he was cleansed from his former sins. Say this, that verse has tragedy written all over it, doesn't it? You know, there's some things that are like, how dare you forget? The idea of what Jesus has done for us and cleansed us and washed our sins away in His blood. Yeah, it is. How dare we forget? But He's suggesting it happens. It happens. So another thing to learn from this chapter, it's remember. Remember. Don't forget. There's a third thing. We've already read through this. We've seen the emphasis on remember, but we've also seen an emphasis, verse 5, you shall keep this service in this month. And then in verse 10, you shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. And he's got this information about when you don't have the leaven and then when you have this feast at the very end. And this is, let me say this, kind of minimal as far as the instruction. Yet nevertheless, he says, you keep this statute. And later on, when you get beyond the Ten Commandments themselves, you begin to have instructions for the tabernacle. Detailed, extensive instructions for the tabernacle. And kind of interestingly, is thrown throughout all of these, once again, detailed, extensive instructions. Exodus 25, verse 9. Listen to this. Exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, so you shall make it. Then you've got instruction about the Ark of the Covenant. Verse 23, the table for bread. Verse 31, the golden lampstand. You get down to the end of that chapter, chapter 25, verse 40, and it says, and see that you make them after the pattern for them, which is being shown to you on the mountain. Well, you've got more instruction about the tabernacle through chapter 26. And once again, it's details. It's extensive details. And you get verse 30. Then you shall erect the tabernacle according to the plan for it that you were shown on the mountain. Then chapter 27, verse 8. It's kind of ending some of it up. You shall make it hollow with boards, as it was shown you on the mountain, so it shall be made. Now, what do you walk away from learning from chapter 13? You shall keep this service. You shall keep this statute. Or when you get to, and we're kind of jumping ahead of the tabernacle, but we're not going to get to the point of the entirety of the book of Exodus in this study, and so probably not even going to get here. So I want you to see this. You read all of these 4 to 5 chapters about the tabernacle and all what goes into it and the service that's to be performed there, and you might get exhausted. Your mind might begin to even spin around in your head. But nevertheless, he says, exactly as I showed you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all its furniture, so you shall make it. Now, I know somebody might walk away and say, Steve, hold on a minute. I don't have to build a tabernacle. That's a part of the old law, which we've been redeemed. We in the New Testament church, that church of Jesus Christ, there's no tabernacle and furniture and the kind of tabernacle service, and we don't have that. What's the point here? You know, the point should be kind of clear. Whatever God has specified, we need to do. One of the attitudes that separates people in the religious world is an attitude of feel good about God, but don't worry about the details. Feel good about God, but don't worry about the details. You say, Steve, what do you mean? In other words, the person gets happy about God, but they don't want to get specific about what His will is, what it teaches, and what God directs and commands. We want to feel good about God, thinking, we're all good with God. But you know, I read a principle, and this principle is throughout the entirety of Old Testament and New Testament, and it is one of complying with God's will, obedience to God's will, as it were, learning the details and obeying those details. If somebody says, well, why? It's because He's God. It's because He's God. He's our maker. In the end, He's going to be our judge. And so, yes, we comply with the details. You know, if somebody wonders about, we're going to talk about what must I do to be saved. Why do we teach what we teach? Because we find it within the New Testament scriptures. You know, that's the why. And when I see faith, that's what we've got to teach and obey. When we read about repentance, well, that's what we then have to teach and obey. The confession of our faith, we read about that. That's why we teach and obey it. Baptism, you know, in the religious world, there's a lot of different beliefs about baptism. My parents, they each had different religious traditions, were taught differently about baptism. One taught it was immersion, one taught it was not. One taught it was for children, one taught it was not. But it comes down to them, well, what does the Bible say about it? And all I find then, the teaching of it being immersion. I find it being water. I find it being of the penitent believer, which leads you away from babies to those who are rational thinking, able to understand. And I read then that it's for the forgiveness of sins. And these are some of the details. They're not details of a tabernacle, they're details of what God teaches about being saved. Somebody says, why do we do what we do in worship? A lot of times people think, well, anything we would offer up to God and call it worship, God should accept. No, it's not exactly the way it works. In fact, in Matthew 15, Jesus speaks of vain worship and connects it with teaching for doctrines and commandments of men. We don't do it God's way. We don't do it God's way. Then it becomes vain worship. God's not accepting it as worship. So here in Exodus chapter 13, I see this about kind of the details and that how that I'm to obey these details. Now, an interesting thing too about this chapter, though, it's found over in verse 9. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes. The law of the Lord may be in your mouth. Some of these words are kind of like the words you find in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 8, which were these two passages were kind of, you might say, the foundation for the Jewish having their phylacteries, their little leather boxes that they'd be tied, you know, on their forehead or on their arm. And you know, the fellow that wanted to look really religious, then he would make his broad, make his big, as if showing out. I have an idea he's talking more about not that literally something is tied to your forehead, but you have it in your mind. You have it in your heart. And then the last part of the chapter, verses 17 through 22, it just kind of goes back then to now their travels. And he doesn't lead them, it says, in the way of the Philistines, lest they change their minds when they basically see a warring people and they want to return to Egypt. And yes, they do take the bones of Joseph, which he had instructed to be taken back to this promised land. And then, of course, that they have that cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night to follow. Like I say, just back to details of this wandering. But as you read this, we should think about, let's make sure we teach our children. Let's be sure to remember, never forget. And let's be sure to realize the details of what God teaches, even if they seem tedious to us. If it's the details of what God teaches, it's to be obeyed. If we could assist you in your obedience tonight, we would be so happy if you would like to confess your faith so we could then assist you in baptism for the forgiveness of sins. If there's a need for prayer, I'd be glad to take the time and pray for you. If you need to come, please come as we